Welcome to Sab's podcast. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. My special guest today is Professor Marandi. He is a professor of English literature and Orientalism at Tehran University. Welcome back, Professor Marandi.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, the last time that we spoke, I know we talked a lot about Israel and what Iran wants. A lot has happened since then, and I'm sure you've been paying attention to the news as well. I want to start off with the recent death of former President Ibrahim Raisi. I want to talk about that for a little bit first because when he passed away, I'm sure, as you know, the Western corporate media the story that they were running with is that the Iranian people were very happy that he was no longer president. And then for people like me that do independent media, I have been watching, of course, people like Richie Medhurst and other people that are covering what's happening in Iran. And I saw a video of Richie Medhurst on the ground in Iran at his funeral, and it was the complete opposite of what corporate media said was happening in Iran. So I want to hear a little bit about that. How do people in Iran feel now that President Ibrahim has passed away?
Well, on the morning when it was announced that he had passed away, almost immediately the BBC asked for an interview. So I sat in front of my desktop like now, and the BBC first began with interviews with people, a couple of people outside of Iran, two ladies, one Canadian Iranian and one maybe British Iranian, I'm not sure. And they were saying how people are celebrating and how people across this country are excited about his death. And then after 10, 12 minutes, the host finally got to me. And I said, and I asked him, what are you going to do when the funeral procession starts? And then people on the streets in the millions are going to be mourning in front of cameras. How are you going to square that circle? How are you going to justify all this anti-Iranian propaganda? And then 3 days later, after a number of the funerals, because the first funeral was in Tabriz city where the helicopter was going, and the funeral was unprecedented. In fact, the president-elect, Dr. Pezeshkian, on that day said that this funeral was unprecedented in the city, and well over 1 million people participated. So, and then the funeral went to another city called Qom, again in the millions, then in Tehran in the millions. And the BBC, the same show, invited me, I think, 3 days later. I think it was a different producer, otherwise they wouldn't have made that mistake. So it was the same hour, 8 in the morning, roughly, I think, 8 and our time, 8:30 a.m. our time. And as soon as the host began, I said, well, 3 days ago I was on this show, and I told you that this is going to happen and that millions of people are going to be on the streets in these different cities. And how are you going to, and I said back then, I asked you back then, how are you going to justify this? And he was taken aback and he said, well, maybe some people are celebrating. And I said, well, there's a huge difference between some people may be celebrating and that Iranians are celebrating. So that's how Western media functions. That's how it works. And this is nothing new. For me, it was not a surprise because this is what I've been growing up with. I've been hearing this sort of thing since I was a teenager. I recall when I was maybe 13, I think it was the New York Times, but I'm not sure. Maybe it was Time Magazine or Newsweek or something like that. It was during the revolution in Iran. And the Shah was gunning, the US-backed Shah, the Western-backed Shah. He was gunning down people on the streets of different cities. Many thousands of people died during the last months of the revolution. And then one of these Western newspapers or magazines published a picture where or a caricature or a cartoon where Imam Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini, was bathing in a bathtub, and he was playing with blood. And the irony, of course, was that his followers on the streets had no weapons. They were demonstrating, and the US-backed Shah was gunning them down. So instead of blaming the Shah, they're blaming the leader whose people had no arms. So from a very young age, I've been forced to deal with these sort of images and this sort of propaganda and these sort of narratives. And so right now it's just ordinary. If anything other than this happens, I will be very surprised.
Do you feel there was foul play in his death? Because when I heard about the helicopter crash, I just thought it was quite convenient that it was his helicopter. It wasn't the only one that was flying through that weather, the weather that they were referring to. They said it was very cloudy, but again, the other helicopters seemed to make it just fine.
I can understand why people would think that way, but first of all, we've had very strange weather all spring. We've had drought for 4 years, but this spring and late winter, we've had rain and snow very often. In fact, it's only become really warm in Tehran for maybe a couple of weeks now. And usually it gets warm much earlier. So the three helicopters which took off, they were supposed to fly over a mountainous area, and then it got cloudy. This helicopter told the other two helicopters, because it was the pilot was the leader of the three. He told them to pull up, and apparently his helicopter didn't pull up in time. He didn't see that they were about to strike the side of a mountain. So there was no sign that the helicopter blew up or that there was any technical failure. But the back part of the helicopter did hit the side of the mountain, and then it immediately fell. And everyone died except for one person who was alive for 2-3 hours. He spoke a few times on the cell phone and told others what the situation was. So far, there's no evidence that it was foul play. I don't think there was, personally, but I can understand why many people would think that way. Dr. AC traveled a lot across the country. He went from city to city, from town to town, and village to village. He went to all the 30 provinces at least once a year, and he would fly to the deprived areas. His focus was on those who were left behind, those who were dispossessed, and because he was very much into social justice. So he was constantly in helicopters, and he had many foreign trips to different countries. So he was working basically 7 days a week, maybe 18 hours a day. It was a lot. There was a lot of flying. So I don't think that there was foul play. But again, if someone thinks otherwise, I understand.
Gotcha. Yeah, because I was one of those people. I was very much like, oh, really now? Very interesting. Well, now there is a new Iranian president named Masoud Pezeshkian.
That's right.
Media is describing him as a reformist president. They are also saying that he had a narrow win. So what does that mean for the Iranian people if it was a narrow victory for him? How are people in Iran feeling about someone like him leading the country now?
Well, he is a reformist, but he's also said that he is a so-called principalist. And I think that sort of says it all. He is somewhat centrist. And I think Dr. Raisi could also be considered a centrist in Iranian politics. I don't mean centrist as in social justice and that sort of thing, but at the center of Iranian politics. In the past, we had presidents who took very radical positions. for good or for ill. President Rouhani, President Ahmadinejad, President Khatami. But I think President Raisi was a person who was more in the center, meaning, for example, he was advocating social justice, which I think is common among Iranian politicians. He wanted to expand relations with the global South. That was a departure of his predecessor, Dr. Rouhani, who was very much focused on the nuclear deal, the P5 with negotiations with the P5+1 and the resulting JCPOA. But that nuclear deal failed, and I think that really led to the failure of his whole presidency. For 8 years, we didn't have growth, and the country was really too much tied up with the nuclear deal. President Raisi took a different course of action. He said he's going to expand relations with the global South. He joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Then he joined BRICS. He also traveled extensively to Central Asia, to the region, to Africa, to Latin America. And he expanded ties with many important countries across the global South and decreased the country's exposure to Western sanctions or decrease the country's dependency on the West. But at the same time, Dr. Raisi was saying that he will continue to negotiate with the West to revive the nuclear deal, but to revive it in a way which the Americans can't cheat again, because the nuclear deal in 2015 had many flaws. The Americans used those flaws under Obama, and then they constantly violated the deal. And then under Trump, the US tore up the deal, and they didn't pay any price for it. So during the negotiations under President Raisi, the government, the foreign ministry, negotiated a deal to protect the JCPOA so that the Americans couldn't just leave or discontinue with its obligations. We almost had a deal. It was about to be signed. The EU foreign policy chief acknowledged that. He said the Iranian, in an interview about 2 years and couple of weeks ago, he said the Iranian demands are reasonable and we're waiting for the Americans to make a decision so that we can move on. But then the Americans pulled back because of the midterm elections. And then after that, we had the riots in Iran where the Americans miscalculated. They were listening to the so-called Iranians, both inside Iran and outside Iran, who were saying the so-called regime is about to fall. And so the Americans did not implement the deal, and they miscalculated as usual, because this, as I said previously in the other show that we had together, the Islamic Republic of Iran has a high degree of legitimacy among ordinary Iranians, as we saw in President Raisi's funeral. In fact, the number of people who participated in his funeral in some of these cities were greater than the number of people who even voted during the presidential election, which shows how popular President Raisi was. So in any case, President Raisi both expanded ties with the global South, including Russia, China, India, and so on, but he continued negotiating with the West, and he almost got a deal till the Americans got cold feet. President Pezeshkian, in many respects, is pursuing a very similar framework for his policies. He's a social justice figure. He was the Minister of Health. During the debates, he was the only person to wear a jacket, not a suit. And not just the debates, but during his rallies and so on. And he too speaks about expanding ties with the global South. He has spoken, the first person who he wrote letters to, exchange letters with, was Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah. He said, we will continue to support you completely, fully, and against the illegitimate Israeli regime. Those were his words. He spoke with President Putin. He spoke to the president of Venezuela. He spoke to the president of Syria, and others. The head of the political wing of Hamas. and he gave them his full support. So countries across the global south, I think, will continue to be his priority. But he too, like President Raisi, says he will negotiate with the West to see if we can strike a deal. But during the last debate, he also qualified that. He said, if the Americans in the West, they fail to make the right decision, we have other options. So I think that, in a sense, while President Raisi was a sort of principlist centrist or centrist principlist, Dr. Pezeshkian is a centrist reformist. And so they're not really all that far apart in their worldview, in my opinion.
That's interesting. Speaking of
some people will in Iran who've heard me say this before have gotten very angry with me. But anyway.
Speaking of Hezbollah, I have watched for months, I've watched Israel attack Hezbollah over and over again. And then eventually Hezbollah did decide to respond recently. There is now a greater scale conflict in the Middle East. It is no longer Israel's assault on the Palestinian people. It is also now including Hezbollah as well. I don't want to see a war escalate at all. But at the same time, the way that I look at it, if I were in their position, you can only get poked so many times before you have to poke someone back, if that makes sense. And it's interesting. I sat there and I listened to corporate media, the number of times that Israel was attacking Lebanon and just constantly defending Israel. But the moment that Hezbollah responds, all of a sudden they're the enemy and they're the bad guy, as if they're just supposed to sit there and continue to be bullied while Israel just does whatever they want to do. This situation in the Middle East has escalated tremendously since October 7th. And it is very clear to me, and I think a lot of people who've been paying attention, what Israel's ultimate goal is. How does Iran feel about what is happening with Hezbollah and Israel? And if Iran had to take a position, do you think that Iran would intervene if this were to escalate even further with Hezbollah, or do you think Iran wants to remain out of this?
So Israel, the Israeli regime, in 1982 invaded Lebanon and captured the capital, Beirut. And many massacres were carried out. In fact, there was a very famous massacre in the Palestinian refugee camps called Sabra and Shatila. And roughly 3,000 Palestinians were massacred within 36 hours by the Israelis and their fascist Christian militia allies in Lebanon. Of course, the Christians in Lebanon are in two camps. One camp is pro-Hezbollah and on the resistance, and the other camp is with the Americans and the Israelis. That camp, they helped the Israelis carried out the massacre with Israeli support. It was during that occupation of Lebanon and Beirut that Hezbollah was created. And it was effectively a national liberation organization. And from 1982 till 2000, they fought against the Israeli regime, forced them to retreat, and ultimately in the year 2000, they left the country. So Hezbollah liberated Lebanon. They liberated the southern half of Lebanon and the capital. But the Israelis kept a small piece of Lebanon for themselves in the south, a small piece of land where they still occupy today. On October the 7th, when Hamas carried out, when there was a breakout, when they broke out from the concentration camp and attacked their tormentors, and I have to really point out here because the young, I don't just want to get into the Hannibal directive, which you know about and your viewers know about, and now how it's becoming clear that the Israelis quite possibly killed most of the casualties on October the 7th. But I do want to point out that while I don't know the specifics, But the party goers, for the most part, who were partying alongside the apartheid wall, they were all people, well, most of them were people who were of military age. And in Israel, all young men and women are a part of the army. So it's not as if these were just some teenagers in downtown Los Angeles who were partying and they wanted to go home and then some thugs drove up and killed them. No, these are soldiers of the colonial regime for the most part, again, unless there's some underage people. If there are underage people partying at 4 a.m., that's a problem in itself. But these were young people who were partying alongside the apartheid wall. And now it's becoming clear that most probably most of them were killed by the Israelis, because Hamas only had RPGs and machine guns. And a lot of the damage was, you saw all those vehicles that were burnt, and they buried them all for obvious reasons. They don't want any evidence left behind. So all those automobiles, they were destroyed by helicopters, by artillery, and by tanks, and those homes as well. The firepower of Hamas they didn't have heavy firepower. They couldn't have caused that sort of damage. But in any case, when October the 7th happened, Hezbollah began to attack the Israelis in that small piece of land which the Israelis refused to withdraw from. So it was a very smart move by Hezbollah, because on the one hand, if they initiated an attack on the Israeli regime, a lot of the pro-Western factions in Lebanon, because Lebanon is fragmented, there's a minority that is anti-resistance, anti-Palestinian, and pro-Western. And there are elements of them among the Shia and among the Sunni and among the Christians. It's not, there are pro-resistance people among the Shia, among the Sunni, and among the Christian, and among the Druze. It's not as if one religion or one sect is on one side and another is on the other side. The divide goes across Lebanon. In the case of the Shia, it's almost overwhelmingly pro-resistance, pro-Palestinian, but not universal. It's not universal. So again, Lebanon is complicated. Hezbollah's allies include Christians, they include Sunnis, Sunni Muslims, they include Druze, and they include Palestinians in the refugee camps. So it is a broad resistance, and they are all in supporting Hezbollah together. So the Hezbollah is fighting on the battlefield, the others are fighting in other ways to protect Lebanon and to support the Palestinians. But the point is that Hezbollah began firing there because they didn't want to divide the country, so they said, well, this is our territory that's occupied, so they started striking there. Then the Israelis struck back, and the Hezbollah fired back at Israel, and it began to broaden. Why did the Hezbollah carry out these strikes, and why is it fighting in the north? To draw forces away from Gaza, because the Israeli regime was carrying out genocide. From the very beginning, that was the plan. All those lies about rapes and beheading, children being beheaded or cooked in the ovens, and all those were lies that were made to create the environment for a Holocaust. And the Western media was a part of it. Western regimes were a part of it. They were all a part of this. Some of them may initially have been ignorant, but after a few days, a few weeks, anyone who had done just a bit of research, they would have discovered the truth. So Hezbollah knew that Israel was hell-bent on slaughtering Palestinians. We could hear it in the words of the Israeli leaders. Again, I don't want to go into material that your audience, which I know they're very politically aware, they know, but they were saying we're going to kill them all. They're Amalek. They said no water, no electricity, no food, no nothing. They wanted to wipe out these people. That was the intention from the beginning. And now we know from the Lancet that most probably the deaths are near 200,000, the real numbers. So this is beyond a genocide. And this is something that the Americans know is going on. The Europeans know they're all complicit in this. So Hezbollah from the very beginning tried to draw as many Israeli forces away from Gaza as possible, to ease pressure on Gaza so that they could resist more easily. And Hezbollah also didn't want the fighting to extend inside Lebanon. So, which would have been more easy for Hezbollah to fight. The war would have been more easy for them to fight if they had done so, because their capabilities are all underground. They have underground capabilities across Lebanon. The most advanced technology can be found in Hezbollah's arsenal. But if they use those, then the Israelis would attack deep inside Lebanon. And Iran didn't want ordinary Lebanese to be involved in the bloodshed. So Hezbollah is fighting alongside the border, which makes them much more vulnerable. So as soon as they fire, the Israelis fire back, and Hezbollah therefore gives many more casualties than it would if it was able to fight in the way it knows how to fight. So they fight from near the border. That makes them more vulnerable. They're pounding the Israelis. They've destroyed much of northern Israel. Between 100 to 300,000 Israeli settlers have moved away from the north, depending on whose statistics you believe. And they are putting pressure on the regime. And on the other hand, you have Ansarullah sort of moving away from your question, but Ansarullah in Yemen, they struck at Israeli ships to put pressure on the regime to end the genocide. The Americans and the British, they came in to help the Israelis continue with the genocide. And that fighting has been going on. And of course, Ansarullah, the Yemeni people, they have the upper hand. The Americans have failed to win in the Red Sea. And the Iraqi resistance, they are also firing at Israel, and they're also threatening American forces in Iraq and Syria, warning them that if you join the Israelis, then you will be destroyed in Iraq and in Syria. So you have this collective resistance in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and of course Iran, helping Gaza to defend itself and to put pressure on the Israeli regime and its allies to end the genocide. That's where we are right now. Do I think the war will expand? I think it's very possible within the next few weeks, Netanyahu will expand the war against Lebanon, but he will definitely lose. He's already lost, and it will become much worse. All he can do is massacre ordinary people, which I'm sure he'd love to do, and so would the Israeli regime. But the difference between Lebanon and Israel is that Lebanon is impoverished because of previous invasions, because the Americans and the Europeans never allowed it to develop. So they don't have much infrastructure. People only have a couple of hours of electricity a day, whereas the Israeli regime has a lot of infrastructure. So if there is war, Hezbollah could easily destroy the Israeli economy. It will be far worse than what they're experiencing now. People are already leaving Israel, and people have stopped investing, and they've taken out their money. If Hezbollah begins to destroy Israeli infrastructure, and they have the capability to do it, that would really be the end of the Israeli economy. And I think, I personally believe Israel is a dying regime. It will take a few years, but if there's war with Hezbollah, then I think that the death will fast forward.
Interesting. There was also a recent report. I believe I saw this just the other day. Israel orders Palestinians to leave Gaza. And the frustration I have here is obviously the Palestinian people, number one, should not have to leave again. They've been pushed out off of their land and pushed into the concentration camp. And then going forward from there as well, if they do leave, they will not be allowed to come back. And I also don't know where they could go. I don't feel that it's on Egypt to open their borders and let them in. And this is a lot of the rhetoric that's coming from more so the right-wing politicians in the United States. They are making the claim that the reason why these other countries are not willing to take the Palestinian people in is because they know that they're all terrorists. That is the claim that a lot of our representatives are making. I don't see it that way. I see it as though, number one, I don't think Egypt has the resources to take take in more people. There are already refugees in Egypt, including Syrian refugees as well, not just Palestinian refugees. But also, it is really not the responsibility of Egypt to fix these problems that the West has created. And my big concern is that you were mentioning the numbers. This goes back to something Ralph Nader said a while back. Ralph Nader said that the numbers were around about what you said, like 200,000, if you were doing the math with the number of bombs that have been dropped. So the amount of people that are left, this is basically just a suicide. Like Israel is just going to go in and they're just going to kill all those people. And I'm embarrassed to be a part of the West. I'm absolutely embarrassed. It's embarrassing. Like I don't know how people feel, more so in your country. I can imagine, but it's embarrassing. And I hope that they know that not all of us, not all Americans feel that Israel is doing the right thing. In fact, most of the people that I've spoken to are against what Israel is doing. But it's just, how do we help the Palestinian people? They have nowhere to go.
Well, here a lot has been said actually about how people in the West have been protesting. A big deal has been made out of all the young Jews that have been protesting against the Israeli regime, both in the United States and in Europe, but especially the United States. Some both religious Jews, Orthodox Jews, and ordinary Jews who've been resisting like everyone else. They've been on Iranian TV. They've been giving interviews and pointing and showing everyone that Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, people from all walks of life in the United States are part of these protests. And in a sense, I would say they're all a part of this resistance. This axis of resistance, which is led by Iran and Syria and Iraq and Lebanon and Yemen, and the Palestinians are part of. I would say that the resistance goes far beyond the axis. It is now a global resistance. I've been to China a couple of times since October the 7th. I've been invited by people there, and the mood with regards to Israel has changed dramatically. People dislike the Israeli regime immensely. And Chinese experts say no one is ever going to invest there again. I've been to Russia a couple of times since October the 7th. The same thing. People dislike the Israeli regime. And in our region, whenever the American media, American politicians and diplomats speak about how the Arabs want to have peace, no, they don't. Only these family dictatorships that are protected by the West want peace with the Israeli regime. The populations in all these countries are extremely hostile. And this is going to have repercussions. These regimes will ultimately pay, because they're doing exactly the opposite of what the people want. Whether it's in Turkey, whether it's in the Emirates, or whether it's in Jordan or elsewhere, or Saudi Arabia, wherever people see their governments behaving hypocritically, they just get more angry. And this is, in the long run, going to harm the West too. Not only this regime, but it's going to harm the West. The West has destroyed itself. Let's be very blunt here. They've destroyed their soft power. They've removed the mask. They have no people across the world don't look at the West favorably. And they will no longer be in any position to pretend that they care about human rights or women's rights or rights in China or Russia or anywhere else in the world, because we see, right before we began this interview, I was posting clips of the massacres in Gaza and in the West Bank. As you know, almost 600 Palestinians since October the 7th have been murdered by these thugs, by these Zionist thugs in the West Bank. So the world has turned against the Israeli regime and against its backers. And I don't think there's any reason for anyone who's protesting and standing up to this to be embarrassed. I think people across the world recognize that those who are protesting in the West, and in particular young Jews, that it's a heroic resistance, because many of these people are paying a price that they don't have to pay. I mean, for me, this is my region, the Palestinian people, it's my cause. For you as an African American, you understand oppression and racism and the disgusting history towards African Americans in the United States, and you get exactly what's going on. But a lot of these young people, they are not dispossessed. They've actually, at least in recent history, they're from prominent families, yet they are protesting. And so, I think people in our part of the world, or at least many, at least in Iran, they recognize this, and they're very grateful that so many people, despite the propaganda of the Western media, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, from all racial backgrounds, that they're all standing together against the Israeli regime. I think, in a sense, this is despite the darkness, despite the fact that 24 hours a day drones are flying over Gaza, they're gunning down children, they're bombing people, children are being maimed, people are starving, cancer patients are dying a slow and horrific death, people are losing their limbs, families are trapped under the rubble, dying a slow death, despite the horrors that we're seeing every day in Gaza. But what has emerged from this across the international community, including in the West, I think is a large segment of humanity that has come together to oppose this. And I think that is itself, there's a great beauty in this.
Yeah, I do. I admire the fact that there has been like this global, resistance to this, because I was surprised that as many people, for me, it's different. Like, this is what I do. I do independent media, so I'm paying attention to what's happened with foreign policy. But for the first time, I was really surprised that as many Americans were paying attention to what was happening with foreign policy. So that was really a big first for me, I think. If you could speak to President Joe Biden, we have an election coming up here in November, and yes, it's Biden and Trump again. If you could speak to President Joe Biden about what's happening in the Middle East, if you had his ear, what would you say?
Well, not just Biden, but what I'd say to all those, including Piers Morgan, who I was on his show a couple of times recently, what I would say is that as a person who believes in God, I would say that you will pay a very heavy price for what you're doing. You're war criminals, and you may or may not escape punishment in this world, but in my eyes, you will pay forever for what you've done, because every single one of these children, these mothers who's been suffering, and many of these people who are now dying, they were suffering for 9 months. At least those who died early on, it was quick. But these people have been moving, as you were pointing out, now they want people to leave Gaza City again. And so people are just constantly on the move, constantly terrorized, wondering, when is this going to be over? Maybe in 2 or 3 months from now, you and I will be speaking, and the war will still be going on. Maybe in 5, 6 months, it'll still be going on. The Palestinians don't know what to do. So they're living in constant terror. These people, history will remember these people for the crimes that they've committed. They're all a part of this genocide. They're all a part of this Holocaust. Every single person in the media, every single Western diplomat, their families, those people around them, they're all those people who own these media companies, those people who fund the politicians and the leaders of the country. They funded their campaign. All of these people are foot soldiers of genocide. Every single one of them. Every single one of them is guilty of genocide. And they will be remembered, just like in history books, they will be remembered like the conquistadors or those who pillaged Africa, the Belgians, the British, Algeria, Kenya, Southern Africa, the whole of Africa, Latin America, India, the subcontinent, Malaysia. This will all be remembered in history books. And what they're doing today in Palestine is particularly evil because they pretend to be civilized. They pretend to be supporting freedom and democracy, but they've shown themselves to be no different from the 18th century and 17th century European leaders, just as evil, just as murderous, but infinitely more hypocritical. So in my eyes, infinitely more evil than those who carried out these crimes in history. They're doing it in front of our eyes. They're doing it in the past. They gave orders. Some people were in the field, but they gave orders from London. They only saw the numbers. But now we're seeing it every hour. All you have to do is look at your Twitter account, or you have to look at your Telegram channel. You know exactly what's going on. So this is unforgivable. And many of these men or women, but mostly men, they are old, and I don't see why they are willing to shoulder the burden of this Holocaust at such a late time in their lives. It's amazing.
I hear you too. There have been a number of times when the United States has been wrong about genocide before, or they were really late to the table. I'm thinking about Rwanda. They would not call it a genocide under Bill Clinton initially. Later on, they had to come back and apologize for that. It was just a couple of years ago, they acknowledged that there was an Armenian genocide. I mean, they're not known for being correct on this issue. And I used to think that, oh, maybe they just got it wrong. But now, considering what's happening to the Palestinian people, now I realize that no, they didn't just get it wrong. I feel like they purposefully misled the American people. And I think they knew exactly what was happening in Rwanda.
Absolutely. They knew exactly what was going on in Rwanda, and they're very much guilty for what happened in Rwanda.
I agree. I hear you. All right, Professor Marandi, do you have any other cool appearances coming up? Because I know you were on Piers Morgan, but
Well, the only cool appearance is on your show. So that's it, basically. In the coming days, if something comes up, I've been approached by Piers Morgan's team to be on another show, but I told them that I don't appear with people with Israelis because I do not consider the Israeli regime to be legitimate, and therefore I won't debate Israelis, but I will debate anyone. I will debate Israeli supporters or Zionists. But since I don't accept the legitimacy of the regime, I won't accept an Israeli. I won't debate an Israeli unless it's an Israeli that opposes Zionism, and there are some Israelis who oppose Zionism, both inside the regime and outside, as you know of them. But in any case, we'll see what happens in the coming days. But I'm very grateful for you inviting me, and I do watch your show, and you do a fantastic job.
thank you.
Thank you.